if you're only going to do one African safari in your life, then don't even overthink it. Go to Kenya, make Masai Mara part of the plan, do Masai Mara the last, because if you do it upfront, everything will be downhill from there and you won't regret it. Right. So that's what I will say. But if you're somebody who's done a lot of East Africa already, and now you're looking for other things, right, from your wildlife experience, right? You want to improve your bushcraft, you want to get more time in the wild, then I would say consider self driving in Southern Africa. You will level up some skills for yourself and you'll get a slightly more immersive experience, albeit with a low density of predator sightings.
And for me, I know that Mara is up there, but somehow, and maybe it's the fact that I've been to Amboseli only once. Amboseli is that one destination in the east that I feel like I can keep going back to again and again, because I don't think I'll ever have enough of, watching large elephants with the Kilimanjaro at the backdrop, right? So for me, it's probably that, and somehow I'm biased towards more open desert like sort of habitats, which is also why probably for me Naipan scores over either say Nxai or Chobe or any of the other places that I've been to in Southern Africa.
Welcome back to F Stopping by the Woods, a nature photography podcast. Today's conversation is sparked by Sumit's blog on how wildlife experiences are different across East and Southern Africa. The East offers a spectacle: blazing sunsets, massive herds crossing narrow rivers, and predators everywhere. And often, we're choosing from a wide menu on which predator to spend our day with. Southern Africa is subtle, quiet, and vast. We spend days with a single lioness if we're given a chance. We drive hundreds of kilometers to see one sable antelope. So there are times when we want an all-inclusive buffet breakfast. And there are times when we want a slow, well-cooked, multi-course meal from a single cuisine. So this conversation is less about which is better and more about what kind of photography thrives in each setting and how to choose based on where we are in our own photography journey.
Hey Sumit, welcome back to another episode of F Stopping by the Woods.
Thank you for having me, mate. It's been a minute.
Yes, all good, and welcome to everyone else who's listening to this. And what prompted this episode is last evening I read this brilliant blog by Sumit, which spoke of photography in East Africa and photography in Southern Africa. And I thought, as I was reading to every single paragraph, I was sort of plus oneing in my own mind and wanting to contribute so much more. And we thought it's a very good idea to have this discussion as a podcast. And here we are. So Sumit, what prompted this blog? Why does this comparison matter?
Yeah, it was a bit of a reflection. I was driving back home from South Africa just a few days back. We've both done safaris in Southern Africa and in East Africa. And there is a different kind of joy that you get from each place, right? And because I was driving back alone, I had the mental space to kind of reflect on both of these kinds of experiences. And I was thinking to myself, what draws me into each area? And if anyone asked me, what would I say to them about which area to visit? And so I kind of actually, the precursor to this was I recorded some voice notes for myself to just unpack my own thoughts. And then because I usually like to write to structure my thoughts, then I decided to write. And that's how the blog post came about.
Yeah, reads really well. And we're going to unpack a lot of the notes in the blog post. And before we get started, could you help us all understand which countries are a part of Southern Africa, which countries are a part of Eastern Africa? How does it look on a map?
Yeah, so look, I think we need to focus on the most popular safari destinations. So right off the bat, East Africa, the most popular safari countries are, without a shadow of doubt, Tanzania and Kenya. That doesn't mean that those are the only safari countries. Uganda is a good safari destination. Ethiopia is a good safari destination, right? And then when you talk about Southern Africa, then South Africa and Botswana are the standout safari destinations. But then there's Zambia as well, there's Zimbabwe as well, there's Namibia as well, which is a fantastic safari destination, especially if you're looking for tranquility and you want to go kilometers and kilometers without seeing anyone and just do your own thing, right? So I would say those are the big safari countries. But when I talk about East Africa, at least, my primary safari experience has been in Kenya. I've visited a lot of places in Kenya. And since a lot of these destinations, at least the very iconic destinations, are part of the same landscape, right? So in Kenya, it's the Masai Mara, right? And Masai Mara is really a small part of the overall Serengeti ecosystem, which majorly is in Tanzania. I think we have some good generalizations between each other to be able to talk about the East African safari experience. And then we've done some travel in Southern Africa so that we're able to generalize across those as well.
Yes. And I think it's also important to sort of understand how different each of these destinations and habitats are with respect to each other. And to me, it sort of goes back to a little bit about my early influences on Africa. One of them was a documentary on the Okavango Delta, and the other was Lion King. And as brilliant a movie as Lion King is, and it's a great sort of gateway, and for me it was when I was a kid and watched it, it sort of paints Africa as this one homogeneous almost landscape, right? And if you think about Lion King, I think there is Amboseli with Kilimanjaro in the background in the Lion King. It seems that the plains in the Lion King are from Masai Mara or the Serengeti. The Pride Rock seems to be, even though the directors have said that it's from the Rift Valley, it seems like it also could be from those rocks in Tanzania, which we've sort of all seen. And there is also rainforest, which interestingly has Timon and Pumbaa. Meerkat in the rainforest, we'll come to that later, but it seems like that could be from either Ethiopia or from Congo or any of those parts in Uganda, right? So it's like a lot of countries into one single story, and it's unlikely. And I'm not even getting into the fact that there is like a mandrill and a meerkat and all of those in the same habitat, but it sort of paints this picture in your mind that, you know, they're all there together in Africa, which is not exactly correct. And it's taken us a little over a decade of traveling to Africa to sort of figure this out. And, you know, Africa is a little bit like, everyone's impression of Africa is a little bit like, you know, the blind man and the elephant. My first impressions of it could be very different from your or someone else's first impressions of it, depending on the habitat or even the specific forest that they visited. And neither of us could be wrong, but it'll take like a sum total of all of these to sort of put Africa together in terms of those wildlife experiences, right? And we're just covering like Southern and Eastern Africa now, right? So what do you think are sort of some of the differences in the vibes and the habitats here? What are the broad strokes with which you can categorize each?
Yeah, so look, I mean, you summarized it perfectly. There are 54 countries in Africa. And on this particular podcast episode, we'll probably be talking about 4, 5, 6 at the most, right? And there, you know, across the continent, you have every imaginable habitat. You have rainforests where you can go and track apes. You have grasslands, the big expansive ones like in the Mara Serengeti ecosystem. But even down south, there are a lot of grasslands, probably not as epic as the ones in the Mara Serengeti ecosystem. Then there is scrubland and thick bush, which you find not just down south in places like the Kruger, but you also find scrubland in places like Samburu, which is north of the equator in Kenya. But then you have riverine ecosystems like the ones which you find in the Chobe. For that matter, parts of the Kruger National Park also have these small riverine ecosystems. The rivers are not as mighty as the Chobe, but you know, the Sabi River flows through the Kruger, and you know, that's where the Sabi Sands Reserve kind of gets its name from. And then there are desert ecosystems. So there are the very iconic multi-story sand dune deserts, like the ones which you find in the Namib. But you also find the more flat deserts, like the ones which you find in the Kalahari, right? Which are more dry vegetation kind of deserts. So you can already see as we start to talk about them, and how can we forget the pans, the Makadi salt pans, which also includes the Naipan National Park, of which you've done a video. There's the seasonal ecosystem of the Okavango Delta. So it's a very, very diverse set of habitats. And often we only think of the wide, expansive plains dotted by the odd acacia tree, which is the most popular image of Africa.
Absolutely. That again goes back to maybe some cover stories of movies and documentaries, and cover photos of movies and documentaries, and maybe even Lion King, right? So how does the kind of habitat shape the kind of photos that you get? How does, for example, photographing in Eastern Africa, which might largely be open grasslands, etc., differ from, say, photographing in say the deserts or maybe in the riverine ecosystems of Southern Africa.
Right. So let's compare those few, right? So let's compare thick bush, grasslands, riverine ecosystems, and deserts. These will probably encompass most of the safari and game viewing destinations that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So grasslands, just because of the abundance of food, is obviously going to be a place which harbors more wildlife. And this is evident. Regardless of which grassland ecosystem you go to, you find a lot of antelope. If there are a lot of antelope, obviously those antelope species can then support lots of predators, so you get a lot of predator action. But this apart, the accessibility is a lot higher because you can then approach game from multiple different directions. And that is amazing, right? The other thing with grasslands is that they tend to be undulating, which means you can quite easily, I'm saying easily with a pinch of salt, but you can quite easily go lower than the animal and position yourself at eye level. Or you can go even lower and let's say it's the rising sun or the setting sun, you can position yourself for a silhouette. So many of those things become easier in a grassland. And in contrast, thick bush can actually support a wide diversity of life, but visibility suffers, accessibility suffers, because how many tracks are you going to have through thick bush? And even if you have tracks, if the bush is really close, you don't get subject and background separation. It's harder for you to go down or go up and get the right angles, turn yourself around, orient yourself. So thick bush becomes challenging. Thick bush, of course, has the advantage that you get multiple different, habitat specialists. For example, you'll get kudu in a certain area, sable antelope in a certain area, orabi in a certain area, etc. Right? And those kinds of habitat specialists can actually give you a more diverse set of photos. So there's that, of course. Deserts, on the other hand, you can actually get a lot of positioning advantages in deserts. Because again, flat habitat, you can move your vehicle around, you can get yourself into different places. But because they don't have abundant food, game is scarce. So while you can get those nice clean backgrounds, you first need to find the game to photograph it in the first place. And then comes riverine habitats. So riverine habitats actually are great for photography because the water acts as a natural reflector. You have game active along the banks of a river all the time because often you're accessing riverine habitats using a boat. You're waiting for the animals to come to the bank. And generally, predators are going to be scarce in that kind of setting, right? Because you're really having to scour banks after banks to be able to find yourself a predator. So then you look for the best photographs that you're able to make, given the light, the setting, the conditions, etc. The flip side is even if you're accessing a riverine ecosystem from land, predators have a lot of places to seek out water from. So then again, finding predators becomes more difficult. Now, of course, there are certain riverine ecosystems where the riverbeds are narrow and therefore, you have great accessibility, those specific drinking spots. And, for example, the Sabi Sands in South Africa, it's a lot easier to track game like leopard because they are at a higher density and there's specific spots along the riverbeds which they're very territorial about. But yeah, that's the contrast across the different habitats.
I think that's fair. And if you had to compare both Masai Mara, which is east, versus say a Naipan, which is a desert in the south, the one thing is both of them had good golden light during sunset. In Mara, it wasn't that hard for us to find a subject. You could move from one group of giraffe to another or move to elephants depending on what the background looked like. If there were trees in the background, if you didn't want trees in the background. And what worked in our favor at Naipan was that we were all concentrated around the waterhole. And invariably, there was a lot of elephants or any other game around that waterhole, right? And likewise, while Mara has a fair number of predators thanks to the large herds that sort of walk through the Mara during seasons, I think Naipan sort of has that advantage in terms of the waterhole, which is where all the game is. And invariably, we find predators at the waterhole, which is sort of what we did there. So I think the way to sort of think about it is in Mara, you're always spoiled for choice in terms of where you want to go, how you want to plan your day. Like I remember talking to our drivers about, hey, do you want to go with the Cheetah Brothers today? Or do you want to go and look at the Pride of Lions? Or do you want to do anything else? Likewise, at sunrise and sunset, we always had a choice in terms of, is there a group of giraffe? Do you want to photograph the impala instead? those kind of always available options, a little bit like a buffet during breakfast, right? Whereas at Naipan, you knew that
Yeah.
more often than not you would be at the main waterhole. You would hope for things to come there, and I think both of them have their sort of pros and cons, because I enjoyed Naipan a lot, because the familiarity with the waterhole gave me a great understanding of the best angles, the best behaviors, because you're looking at the same things almost every day. You become very, very good at predicting what's going to happen, the path the elephants are going to take, and you can sort of prepare your angles for photography. You observe them that much more closer. So yeah, I think again it's hard to choose, but I think I am going to sort of put you in a spot here and ask you to sort of choose. What is your favorite habitat? Maybe one from the southern African landscape and one from east, if you had to pick one each.
A very, very interesting question. Before that, let me just actually point out a very important distinction for our listeners that, look, it really depends on where you are in your wildlife journey, because waiting it out at a waterhole is not everyone's cup of tea, not something that everyone finds enjoyable. So, for example, if you're just about starting out in wildlife photography, a place like the Serengeti Mara ecosystem allows you to roam the place a lot more rather than just staying stationed at one place and waiting for the wildlife. And I can totally imagine why that might be more stimulating for some people, right? Whereas, you've seen Africa quite a bit, you've done a fair bit of wildlife photography, and then you see the merit in probably staying put for 5 days at a waterhole. Yeah, that might be some people's thing, but may not be the thing that they do right up front in their wildlife photography adventures, right? So coming back to that question that you asked me, favorite destination in East Africa, I would say without a shred of doubt, like no question about it, the Masai Mara. Amboseli would come a close second, but Masai Mara still wins just because of the diversity of game and how easily you can find predators there.
Yeah.
And yes, you don't have the super tuskers there, but you have pretty amazing tuskers. East African tuskers are always more splendid with their bigger tusks. So even the females there have pretty big tusks. So I would say East Africa, no question, the Masai Mara. In fact, if you asked me which destination do I think is the most productive for wildlife photography in Africa, I would say the Masai Mara, no question, right? If I could afford it, I'd go there every year. And then in Southern Africa, because now we're talking about the bush experience, right? I would actually have a slightly unpopular choice, and I would say the Kruger National Park. Now, I know why a lot of people have a problem with the Kruger National Park, especially photographers. They'll be like, half of the roads are tar roads, etc., etc. But I feel like Sandparks does a fantastic job in making it a holistic experience for you. So you have stay inside the park, you have picnic sites where you can stretch, you can get yourself some food, and down south, then you can benefit from the community of travelers that is actually visiting the park, because there's an app on which sightings get reported. So you can go, and it kind of eases you into the self-drive experience. And then the south of Kruger is great for two things. One is leopards and the other is wild dogs. And neither of them are trivial things in wildlife. So that.
We'll talk a little bit more about where one is in that photography journey and how sort of that helps choose destinations in east and south respectively. Yeah, but on the whole point of Mara being the one place which is the most productive in terms of wildlife photography, if you look at how most photography tours are operated in Kenya, right? Because you land in Nairobi, they have either a Nakuru, or they have a Nevasha, or they have a Bogoria for a couple of days. They might do Amboseli at the start itself, but they all invariably end with 4 or 5 days in the Mara, because everybody knows that Mara is the high point and there's good reason for doing that. And for me, I know that Mara is up there, but somehow, and maybe it's the fact that I've been to Amboseli only once. Amboseli is that one destination in the east that I feel like I can keep going back to again and again, because I don't think I'll ever have enough of watching large elephants with the Kilimanjaro at the backdrop, right? So for me, it's probably that, and somehow I'm biased towards more open desert-like sort of habitats, which is also why probably for me Naipan scores over either say Nxai or Chobe or any of the other places that I've been to in Southern Africa. Looking forward to a few more trips in Southern Africa, but based on my limited experience in Southern Africa, Naipan's the place for me. Could you talk a little bit more about wildlife density?
Yeah.
I know you spoke about it in terms of iconic species and the kind of species that are found in sort of each place, but let's sort of divide them in terms of, say, megafauna and sort of rare species that you can find only in a certain park and so on and so forth, right? So how do Southern Africa and Eastern Africa compare in this regard?
Yeah, if you cover enough ground, both in East Africa and in Southern Africa, you will see a wide diversity of species. But as it turns out, we rarely cover enough ground. So often people's visits will be limited to one park, right? So then, if you think of it, consider, let's say, the Masai Mara, right? You will see a lot of species. You'll see topi, you'll see Grant's gazelle, Thompson's gazelle, buffalo. It's a big five park, right? But the Masai Mara doesn't have white rhinos, for example. It is very rare to find some of the other antelopes, right? So Kenya does have kudu, but you're not going to see kudu in the Mara, right? So because the kudu is a drier habitat antelope. On the other hand, because of how big the Kruger is from south to north, right? It encompasses a variety of habitats from grassland to bush to riverine habitats, etc. So in one park, you're able to see a whole bunch of different kinds of antelope. And I often predicate biodiversity in the number of species of antelopes I'm seeing, right?
Yes.
And so that's one of the key differences to keep in mind, that the more habitats you're able to traverse, the more of those habitat specialists you're going to encounter. But if you take a little bit of a step back and say, all right, I go on a safari to Kenya, I'm probably going to include a little bit of Lake Naivasha and Nakuru, as you said, right? So then that gives you a different set of habitats, which is the Great Lakes. If you go up north, then you get to the drier places, and in Samburu you have a completely different set of animals, right? It's a different ostrich, a different giraffe, a different zebra, so on and so forth. So you can actually get habitat diversity even by just going to Kenya. It's just that when we go to Kenya, we spend a lot of our time in the wide open plains, which then limits the kind of diversity that we are able to see.
So on Kenya and the Great Lakes, right? Since that's one destination I've done a fair bit as well, I would really consider people to start adding Bogoria. And I'm not sure what the water conditions in the
Yeah.
flamingo populations there have been like in the last few years, but what Bogoria gives you is, apart from the millions of flamingos that you can see, it also has some really large kudu herds, right? So that's really good. It's a very sort of different habitat if you're able to take some time away from the flamingos and sort of drive around the bush. And between Naivasha and Nakuru, maybe you could do just Nakuru, because Nakuru has also the white rhinos. Nakuru has the really unique habitat as well, where if you're lucky, you might be able to see the pride of lion that specializes in sort of climbing trees. So yeah, maybe think about Nakuru, think about Bogoria, and then head to Mara, which is one way of doing it, and see if you want to add Naivasha if you have the time. There's also isn't there El Pajeto en route?
Yeah, Olpajeta is probably the best place in the world to see both rhinos, which is the white rhino and the black rhino. And they also have those very, very endangered northern white rhinos that they keep in an enclosure. So even if you don't actually photograph them, at least you'll see the last few. Naivasha, by the way, is special just because it's one of those places where you access the game in a boat, and that's different from Nakuru. Nakuru, you're mostly in a car.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to kind of enliven your safari experience, that's one thing you can do, where you can photograph hippos at eye level and that kind of thing. And you've got some shots from there which are fantastic.
I mean, thank you for calling out my shots. But yeah, I think the experience of photographing hippos from a boat at Naivasha is unparalleled. I can keep going back to that again and again. Yeah, you just want the waters to be a little bit calm. The last couple of times I went there, the water was very choppy and probably had to do with time of day. But yeah, the one time I got those shots was in the evening when the water was really calm and we were able to get some really good shots of hippo from the boat almost at eye level. So yes, that's that on Naivasha. So in terms of photography, logistics, cost, practicalities, and so on and so forth, thank you for that super detailed analysis that breaks down cost, that breaks down logistics, that breaks down sort of, the differences in planning if you were to do it yourself, or if you were to sort of camp, and if you were to stay in a chalet, and everything else associated with that. I've also got a video in which I've sort of detailed out, to the best of my knowledge, what it takes to camp in Southern Africa. But can you talk us through a little bit about the logistics and practicalities of these two parts of Africa?
Yeah, see, you can actually mask out many of the logistics for yourself by going with a tour company. And if you find a good tour company, then that's great. But I've generally found that most of the tour companies, at least in East Africa, tend to give you rather milquetoast guides. These guides live in Nairobi. They're very far from the habitats that they often guide in. So they don't have up-to-date local knowledge about what's happening there. Anyone who's done any number of wildlife safaris will know that local knowledge is, probably the cheat code to getting great wildlife sightings. So this goes to say that I usually like working with a guide direct, or at least a tour company that employs a guide I trust, one of those two. And then in that, there are a number of different costs that come in. There are the park permit fees, there is the rental cost of the vehicle, there is the cost of stay, and I'm not even getting into things like tips, gratuities, gifts, etc. Right? So these are costs that are almost recurring. So in East Africa, if you did it by yourself, you will have to pay the park fees by yourself. You will have to pay the guide and for the vehicle by yourself, and you will have to probably book your accommodation yourself. Unless, of course, you're going the tour operator route, in which case my only suggestion will be find a guide and then find the tour operator that employs the guide. So that's So then if you look at guided experiences down south in Southern Africa, oftentimes these are connected to a lodge. So your best bet is to just go to a lodge that is renowned for its sightings. And for people who haven't read about this already, remember that in places like the Kruger or even in the Delta, there are concessions marked out. A concession is productive based on the traversing rights it has, which is to say that let's say there is concession A and concession B, and both of these fellas are friends, then they have traversing rights across each of their areas. So pick out lodges and concessions that give you the most traversing rights, because then that gives you the rights to access more wildlife, access more areas, access more predators, right? So once you go to a lodge of your choice, then from that point on, everything is taken care of. Your guides are taken care of, your vehicles are taken care of. There is no notion of a permit, food, etc., all sorted. Then comes the most DIY option of them all, which is self-driving, in which case you've got to pretty much do everything. You've got to spend on your fuel, you've got to spend on your food, you've got to spend on your permits, rental, and you guide yourself. There, the costs are the most transparent, and you have full control on how low you want to bring your costs. You could eat cheese and eggs every day, and your cost will be very low. Or you could eat the most beautiful steaks every day and your cost will be a little higher. But in general, that's going to be also the most cost-effective option, at least when you think about the number of days you can be out there in the field. So that's how I'd like to break it up, I would say.
Yeah, I think the broad breakdown of costs based on what you put up is about 8,000 to 9,000 at Mara for a couple. And if you were to do Southern Africa and you were to be in, say, Kruger, even in a chalet, it's about, say, 2,500 to 3,500. And if you were to do the Delta through a guided tour or a safari company, it's going to be upwards of 20,000 and so on and so forth. And yeah, just pointing out there that there was a time when we used to visit Mara when it was much cheaper. And I think the park fees have gone up about 2.5 times in the last year and a half or so, which has made it so much more expensive than it sort of used to be. And we want to sound like uncles talking about the good old days of Mara when it wasn't so expensive. But there was a time when Mara wasn't as expensive as this. And it just, now that it is at this cost, it makes those days that much more dear.
Yeah, indeed.
The other point that
we live in a country where I was saying we live in a country where the currency isn't very powerful. So if costs multiply, our ability to visit a certain place goes down.
Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about when you spoke of the guides and or a tour company who just offers a guide is that I think for both of us, the default way has been to match your dates to the guide availability. So I've always called up the 2 or 3 guides that we go with, whom we trust, found out when they're available, and then booked my plan accordingly. And that's how important the guide can be. And the reason why that's super important is because over some time, the location of a sighting or the nature of a sighting becomes public knowledge in Mara because people are well connected to radios and so on and so forth. So most guides are able to get you to a place, but a good guide is probably able to get you there before the action starts because you want the hunt, right? Everybody can get the shot of the cheetah carrying the gazelle away, but you want to see the hunt, right? And I think that's where a good guide matters in terms of their knowledge of the local landscape, their knowledge of local wildlife. And another place in which the good guide really matters, and this is underrated, is in terms of how easily they know where to park the car from a photography perspective, which angles they want to park the car in. And you and they have an understanding in terms of, hey, I want to shoot this backlit or I want to shoot this in great light. And this is super important because there, I'm assuming we'll get off-roading permits and they're able to maneuver the car in such a way that we're able to get the best angles. And you don't want to be directing them too much because if we're shooting and we're driving, we can park where we want. We have the best angles. But it is super important to have that understanding between you and your guide in terms of where you want the vehicle to be parked. And that is the only thing that you're paying the premium for, the local knowledge and the fact that they know how to drive for a photographer. So yeah, that is the reason why we sort of align our dates with when some of our favorite guides are available. Anything else on that?
Add one more thing to that. Yeah, I want to add one more thing. There's a third thing that you're paying a premium for is how well they know you and your past experience in that habitat. For example, the guide that I work with, he knows what photographs he's got me in the past. So if I'm going for the same photographs and there are other photographs available, he will tell me to leave the sighting and go somewhere else because he knows he can get me a different set of photographs. And I think that relationship that you cultivate with somebody on the ground is super important in enriching your experience each time. So otherwise, every time you go, you have reset your experience and you start from scratch and you're getting the same portraits, the same silhouettes over and over. So knowing you is also worth paying a premium for.
Absolutely. So given all this, Sumit, and assume that we are talking to Indian photographers, what would be your advice to them in terms of how to go about planning their next safari trip in Africa?
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a definitive, clear answer to it, but here's what I'll say. If you're only going to do one African safari in your life, then don't even overthink it. Go to Kenya, make Masai Mara part of the plan, do Masai Mara the last, because if you do it upfront,
Yeah.
everything will be downhill from there and you won't regret it. Right. So that's what I will say. But if you're somebody who's done a lot of East Africa already, and now you're looking for other things, right, from your wildlife experience, right? You want to improve your bushcraft, you want to get more time in the wild, then I would say consider self-driving in Southern Africa. You will level up some skills for yourself and you'll get a slightly more immersive experience, albeit with a low density of predator sightings. And this is something that I do mention quite a bit, which is that in the Mara, I'm so spoiled for predator sightings that I often don't stop for the little things. But because predator sightings are scarce in Southern Africa, you then have to keep yourself busy and you have to become a little more light driven and situation driven than being subject driven. Because on a given morning, if we know that the cheetah coalition hasn't hunted in the Mara, we can actually go and specifically target them and say, let's go hang with these fellas this morning. You can be very, very specific. So being subject driven in a place like the Mara or the Serengeti makes total sense. On the other hand, you don't have the ability to target, at least on a self-drive, specific animals. So in that case, just be subject driven and see what nature throws up and react to that particular situation. Be light driven and situation driven and react to the situation as against being subject driven. So that's what I would say. First and only safari, east. You want to level up, go south.
I think that's a great way of looking at it, right? And just to add to your point on us not stopping for anything but a predator in Mara, it really broke my heart the first and second time I went to Mara, where everything you're seeing there is new. You haven't seen the topi, you haven't seen the eland, and they're all very, very beautiful antelope. And our guide was refusing to stop at any of them because he heard about a leopard, and you know how this particular guide can get when he hears about a leopard somewhere, right? So I was like, I want to shoot this, it's great light, but he would be like, no, we're going elsewhere. And I think one way of looking at it is, if you're from India and most of your wildlife photography has involved going to a place and staying in like a resort, which then has jeeps that takes you to a safari, or which has the government jeeps that take you to safari, be it Corbett, Ranthambore, Kana, Pench, or down south, then I would recommend to not make the big leap directly and do a self drive in Southern Africa or Southern Africa overall, and instead do east and go to any of these guides who offer you pretty much the same thing and experience Africa that way. Sort of try to be as satiated, if there is such a thing, with the African wildlife in terms of predators, and then move to maybe Southern Africa. And just to give you my example, I've been to the Masai Mara 4 times, and not one of it has been during the crossing. Okay, so I've only done, so to say, off seasons in Mara, because I don't think I've had my fill of photographing predators there, right? And I know that you do get a fair share of predator and hunt action during crossing as well. But I want to do crossing at a time when I can just park myself at a riverbed all day long and just wait for a good crossing to happen, and do that for every single day that I'm there without getting distracted by a call on, hey, there's a lion pride a little distance away, or hey, there's cheetahs a little distance away, and so on and so forth. So yeah, maybe the next time I do Mara, it will be during crossing. Let's see how that pans out. But yeah, I think going back to the earlier point, it is to do east first, ideally Kenya and maybe Tanzania if you can afford it as well. Because both Kenya and Tanzania are, and I think we didn't speak about this a little bit, even though you mentioned it very well in your blog. They have these events, right? They have these mega spectacles. Like there's the crossing, which happens in Kenya, which is a big deal. There are the calving of wildebeest, which happens in Tanzania. Tanzania also has a very beautiful park in the Gorongoro, which is a crater, so the density of wildlife is great there. All down south in Amboseli, you've got, during some seasons, a high concentration of elephant, and you've got a few of the really, really big super tuskers there, which you can photograph at close proximity. So yeah, there are these big events, big spectacles in the east. South is a little more sort of subdued. So I would say, yeah, do East Africa. And then when you feel up to it, then when you feel up to the fact that you can sort of show yourself around in Africa yourself, then do Southern Africa, and then see if you can sort of do a self-guided or a camping trip yourself.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. There are a couple of little points I'd like to mention just so that people can educate themselves on that decision that they're making, because I'm appreciative of this, that for a lot of people, an African safari is a trip of a lifetime, right? So number one is think about tranquility. So on my first trip to Africa, I didn't care. I'm from India. I'm used to crowds, right? But be aware that when you see a cheetah in a place like the Masai Mara, you will have to share that sighting with 40 odd vehicles. And that's just the fact of the matter. You cannot do anything about it. The good thing is guides are really good at staying out of each other's way, giving the animal a wide berth, not getting in the way of the hunt. But if having a number of vehicles around you bothers you, then remember that that's going to be an issue in East Africa. It does not bother me. All right. So that's number one. The other is the guiding experience. So in East Africa, and I don't think this is just our experience, this is the experience of many people who've visited East Africa multiple times. The guides are very, very focused on predator sightings. And they will be razor focused on getting you from one predator to another predator to another predator. And for me, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I'm there for. I do not need a natural history lesson. Show me the goddamn predator. But do remember that some of you have family who may want a little bit of interpretation, right? Where the guide just pauses, explains the animal's behavior to you. You take a little bit of a breath. And that may not necessarily be the case in East Africa. Generally, in Southern Africa, guides are a lot better at interpreting the animal's behavior for you and giving you a little bit of a natural history lesson. And then number three is related to the point which you mentioned, Anurup, which is the peak seasons. Of course, the peak seasons are spectacular, but you'll also have the most number of people there. The costs will be the highest there. So do research some of the shoulder seasons. For example, a lot of people don't know that October and November is calving season for every other antelope and the warthogs, other than, of course, the wildebeest. The wildebeest are out by then. But the crowds are also out by then, and you can then go and photograph the pandemonium that ensues when predators are going after little ones of different antelopes. So October, November, fantastic time to go. Shoulder season, prices are a little low. Then, as the season progresses, there's a short spell of rain in December, but then there is another dry spell in January and February, which is a spectacular time to visit a place like Kenya because the predators are incredibly desperate. So lions will try to go after big game like buffalo, and the lands in Amboseli dry up and you get a clearer view of, let's say, the Kilimanjaro in January and February when there's no rain, right? So if you research these shoulder seasons, you'll probably actually find some seasons which give you a good balance of photographic opportunities, lower costs, and lesser number of vehicles in the park.
I think that makes for an interesting podcast discussion itself. We should talk about what to do maybe in Kenya from a photography point of view, sort of month by month, and sort of weight against crowds and costs. And that's going to be a good discussion to have as well. But yeah, absolutely spot on. It's costlier to go during the high spectacle seasons. The shoulder seasons are quite good. And yeah, it sort of correlates well with the hunts I've seen in Mara all being in November, which is also the sort of the calving season. I saw a baby warthog get taken away by a lion pride, and I saw a young Thompson's gazelle foal being taken away by a cheetah, both of it during my trip in 2022, which was in November. So yeah, also on the point of if you're doing Masai Mara, it's going to be all about predators. So if you're keen on wobblers in Africa, Masai Mara is probably not the place for you, and you want to find a non-safari guide. So yes, I'm calling that out as well. So in terms of this, right, we all have our destinations sort of chalked out. Not we all. You and I have our destinations chalked out in terms of where we're going next. Sabi Sands next year. We're also planning Kalagadi in the year after that. Hopefully that plans out well. And I've seen your plan. It includes Mara a little later. So I'm looking forward to sort of all this. But I'm going to sort of put you in the spot here again and say, if you had one more trip to do and you knew that this is going to be your last wildlife trip in Africa, what park would you pick then?
If you said one trip to Africa and no more, is that the question?
Yeah. If you knew this was your last trip.
Without a shadow of doubt, I will go to the Kalahari because, it's a park which I've experienced in a very truncated kind of fashion, and I want to give it a good, solid crack. And I think it brings together a number of different things for me, Anurup. So one, of course, it brings that joy of exploring by myself. It's also a park that does not have a lot of footfall just because the carrying capacity of the park isn't great in terms of accommodation, etc. There are places up north where you may not see another vehicle for about 100 kilometers. And then, I love these open habitats, desert-like, golden grass, dunes, that kind of thing. And it's that aesthetic that kind of draws me as a photographer. And I don't mind working hard for the photographs, right? So it's one of those parks that just feels very charming, very enchanting for somebody like me. It's one of those little love stories that kind of needs to have closure.
Yeah, I think, there was a boss that told me this in like a marketing context where he'd say that if it takes you 6 beers to get on a happy high, you can't say that you want to have your 6th beer first and then be high, right? And it's a little bit like that. You need to reach a certain point in your wildlife journey to feel strongly about any sort of place, right? And I totally get where you're coming from in that context, that you need to have done, and you've done Africa every year for the last 13 or 14 years, at least once, right? So that's totally understandable. In my case, at this moment, if you were to tell me that there's one trip left, probably going to be the Mara, because I don't think I've had my fill of the big predators. I don't think I've had my fill of the silhouettes that happen at sunrise and sunset. So that's probably that for me. And I am looking forward to our Southern Africa trips in the next 2 years. And maybe my answer will change then. But for now, it's very much Mara in East Africa. And even though my favorite destination in Africa from everything I've seen so far is probably Amboseli, I'm likely to be biased towards Mara as the last trip because I'm hoping to do a few more there. And I've not seen a crossing. I've not seen a river crossing, a big herd of wildebeest and zebra. So looking forward to sort of see that. And I think that's
man,
that. Sorry.
No, I was saying about the crossings. It's one of those things that even though I've been to the Mara twice during crossings, I've not been lucky to actually see a spectacular crossing. So, if I can afford it, that's one of those things I really, really want to do and probably see at least one spectacular crossing with dust, pandemonium, everything going batshit crazy. That's definitely on my bucket list. It's just it's become so bloody expensive.
It has become very expensive, and I don't know when I'll do it. We have to do one during the peak season. We don't know when, but yeah, let's see how it pans out. And so thank you, Sumit, for your valuable time. Thank you to everyone who's been listening to it this far. And I'm going to ask you the same question that Sumit and I just answered. If you are somebody who's been to Africa a few times and you had to go to one more place, what is that place going to be? And if you're somebody who's never been to Africa and you're planning one, what do you think that destination is going to be based on everything else that we've shared so far? So that's that. Thank you for listening. Hope to come back with more of these soon.
Thank you, mate. Let us know
Thank
in the
you.
comments.